Welcome, brothers and sisters from Westside, and anyone else joining us for our last study of the patriarchs in the book of Genesis. We've been looking at chapters 12 through 50, so our study tonight will begin in chapter 49, verse 8, in the blessing that Jacob does of his 12 sons. We covered Reuben, Simeon, and Levi last week, and so we want to pick up, of course, with Judah, which is very significant for obvious reasons. If you know the Bible, that Jesus descended from Judah, and of course, it is the Bible's focus. So we really are glad that you've been with us through this study. I hope that it has been beneficial and helpful to you. Thank you for all the kind remarks that many of you have made in person or by text or by email. And that really is a teacher's encouragement to know and get feedback. So we are very, very thankful for that. All right, so we are ending the story of Joseph. He's not one of the patriarchs. He has the longest section of any one individual in the book of Genesis, but he plays such a pivotal role in, of course, the increase of the nation, and that is a huge part of the Abrahamic covenant that the nation would grow to be as innumerable as the stars of heaven and the sand that is on the seashore. And of course, part of that fulfillment is found in the physical descendants of Abraham, but the ultimate is in the spiritual descendants of Abraham. So let's begin then in chapter 49 and verse 8 with Judah and the blessing that Jacob bestows upon him. He says to him, Judah, your brothers will praise you. And of course, that's a play upon the name Judah. Leah, his mother, had named him Praise, gave praise to God at his birth, because Judah was the fourth son, and she, of course, was trying very desperately to get Jacob to love her as Jacob loved Rachel. In the end, she would provide him with 6 of the 12 sons that make up the 12 tribes of Israel. Of course, Judah, that the king would come from, the kingly line, David, and of course, ultimately the Messiah, and of course, the priestly line under the Old Testament, Levi, Aaron would come from that tribe. And so, again, Judah was named that, and that's a play on his name. To go further, he says, your hand will be on the neck of your enemy. So if we think about Judah, both in the days of the judges and then, of course, under David, there is this time and time again the successful warfare over the enemies of God's people, which had to be, of course, physically battles that were drawn up and battles that were committed in the Old Testament, and victories that many times went to Israel because of Judah. Your father's sons, the third part of verse 8, will bow down before you. Again, as was true for Joseph, so Judah will reign over his brothers. And of course, that obviously is through the Davidic line. This quote from Revelation 5 and verse 5 in the picture. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has conquered. And so ultimately a reference to the Messiah who's coming through the Davidic line and referencing him as the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And of course, that's a play on what is talked here about Judah and acting as a young lion with its prey. All right, in verse 10, the statement is made that the scepter shall not depart from Judah. So obviously, a scepter symbolizes royal power and rule of a king. So a long staff generally was held in the king's hand when speaking publicly, especially when he was speaking publicly, to signify his authority over his people. Here is a picture of Darius the Great of Persia, who is sitting on his throne, and he is holding a scepter in his right hand and a lotus flower, which had been a symbol of their power and authority in Persia. Now, this comes many centuries later, but would be a common motif in the ancient Near Eastern world, of which obviously Israel would plays a role in that culture would understand. And so the scepter is that long staff, like a shepherd. So often the Old Testament, as well as writings outside of the Bible, reference kings as being shepherds of their people. In fact, even the Pharaoh had the crook and the staff that he held, both as his symbol of authority. All right, and then he goes on to say about that scepter, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. Now, you'll notice that That is a euphemistic phrase. A king on his throne would place the staff between his feet. If you'll look again at the picture of Darius, this is a carving, a relief in the stone. And you'll notice that the staff is not to the side of one of his feet, or otherwise you'd see the line going behind the left foot or in front of the right foot. But rather it is placed here, even by the Persian king, between his feet. So it's a euphemism because giving birth to children, because children come out between the feet. Judah's descendants will always rule the nation. The ruler's staff will not depart from between his feet. So the descendants of the line that will come eventually will continue to rule over God's people, and ultimately through Jesus. All right, so controversial phrase, how to translate the third part of verse 10. Until tribute comes to him, the English Standard, the New Revised Standard translate it with that phrase. So obviously a king exacted tribute from conquered peoples, and Judah's kings would do that. You have several references of King David and Solomon receiving such tribute from those that they had conquered. In fact, in this slide, 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 21 mentions that about Solomon. But the other way that it is translated, and you'll see that in the footnote, by the way, in the English Standard, if you'll go down and look at it, and it's just a slight revocalization. Again, Hebrew words, just like in English and any language, sometimes sound like other words. So just with a slight revocalization, slight emendation, as the footnote of the English Standard says, it can be translated until Shiloh comes. Now, the King James, Old King James, the New King James, the New American Standard, just name a few, translate with this phrase. And many have seen the word Shiloh as a reference to the Messiah. But this is problematic, and I'll point out three of the major arguments that often are made. First of all, the idea of Shiloh is nowhere else in the Old Testament used as a messianic title. Now, there may be, I didn't get to do that intensive study to find out that there might be messianic titles that only occur once. So that wouldn't necessarily then make this the end-all be-all argument. But it is interesting that it is not used anywhere else in the Old Testament. The other thing, when you couple it with this, the New Testament never cites this verse as being fulfilled in the Messiah. In fact, it just ignores chapter 49, verse 10, which would seem very, very odd because almost all of the messianic passages are referenced in the New Testament. So it would seem really, really odd that if this was referring to the Messiah, very overtly, that Shiloh stands for the Messiah, and that's how it is translated in that phrase, then you would expect to see that mentioned by the apostles in their writings that came after Jesus had ascended to the right hand of the throne of God when he ascended after his resurrection. The third thing that we need to mention is that no scholar knows exactly what Shiloh means. Now, a lot of times you'll see that it means peace. I gave you in the question several verses that seem to suggest, obviously, that Jesus is a Prince of Peace. But as Walke says, the meaning of the Hebrew here, the Hebrew that is translated Shiloh, is arguably the most debated in the book of Genesis. Again, no scholar knows exactly what Shiloh means. If we instead take the English Standard, then there is a good coupling here, meaning that the two parts of that verse, C and D, correspond to each other. For instance, if until tribute comes to him, the line of Judah, that is, foreign peoples pay tribute to one who has conquered them, to the king, in this case David, Solomon. Then it says, if this is the correct translation in 10c, 10d says, to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. And peoples would be Gentiles, would be the ones outside of the line of Israel, even though that be true that Israel would give their obedience to the king too. So as Wenham says, it produces a good poetic line in parallel, C and D, with the next line, the peoples obey him, C paralleling D. Tribute from foreign nations express their submission to the Judean king. And so I think that is correct. I think the standard is correct when it translates that. But you can do your own study and find out what you think about that. All right, verse 10, I want you to center on until tribute comes unto him, until this sovereignty of Judah is brought to its highest point. And obviously, some would see in that the messianic uh, idea. And no scholar argues that in the end that is true of the Davidic line, and therefore could be obviously very easily an extension of this passage. Why some would believe until Shiloh comes that Shiloh is a reference to Jesus, Shiloh meaning peace. But again, we've looked at that. Read Wyndham's quote with me. All at least agree, that is, all the scholars, that this line is predicting the rise of the Davidic monarchy, and that seems very, very obvious, and the establishment of the Israelite empire. If not the coming of a greater David, if it's not also referencing Jesus, the coming of the greater David. And if the primary reference is to David, traditional Jewish and Christian exegetes, those that take out of is what exegesis means, to understand what the Bible's saying, would agree that like other Davidic promises, it has a greater fulfillment in the Messiah. So nobody is saying that this is not a passage to be connected with the Messiah, because he is the great and final king that comes from David, and that's, of course, what the Bible is pointing to. But it still has problematic deals with the translation, as we've mentioned. All right, verse 11, he says that Judah will bind his foal to the vine and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. So you would take a young donkey, bind them to a grapevine. Now, again, until is still this is part of that until. At some future point, as Kidner says, the scene becomes an earthly paradise such as the prophets foretell in their messianic poems. That they'll wash their clothes, as he goes on to say, in wine rather than water. To give you an example of one of the prophets, Amos chapter 9, verse 13. I don't have that on the overhead. But Amos says there, behold, the days are coming. So that's always in the prophets, looking to the messianic days, looking to the future. Behold, the very distant future. Behold, the days are coming when the treader of the grapes, the ones who tread out the juice from the grapes, as you see women mashing it with their feet, overtakes the sower of the seed. So imagine something that is so prolific that the one that's reaping the harvest is overtaking the one that sows the harvest. It's like somebody's throwing seed out, and as soon as he throws it out, the one is coming behind him to reap. So prolific will be the days of the Messiah. And it goes on to say in the Amos passage, the mountains will drip sweet wine and the hills shall flow with it. So that's what Kidner is referencing when he says one would bind his foal or his donkey to a choice vine. Yet, in physically talking about, if you did that, if you took a physical donkey, a real donkey, and bound him to your choicest grapevine at the height of the grape season, that donkey's going to sit there and eat all the grapes. And you would ruin your harvest, at least for as much as the donkey could get to. Nobody would do that. But the point of this language is excess, abundance. So abundant will the wine be that it won't matter if a donkey eats the choicest of your vines. And he goes on to say, you will wash your clothes in wine and not water. That's how when you think of wine being one of the great blessings, that is, from the grapes and from the blessing of a good harvest, that's spoken of often in the Old Testament as being God's blessings, the wheat and the barley and all the grain that they needed to eat, and then to have the wine from the grapes. So this idea then in the messianic sense, in the spiritual sense, the great kingdom that Jesus will set up is going to be an abundant of blessing. And as that goes into things that, of course, the New Testament points out to us more and more. Now, as I said to you last week, if we try to understand all of these various blessings that are given to these different tribes that we see here in the map, as one man says, you're just going to get a bad headache. And here's a good example of it. I'm only going to talk about Zebulun. Judah, the first three, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, we need to talk about, and we did last week. Judah, yes. Joseph we'll mention, yes, because of the long longness of it, but I just wanted to pull one of these out to show you how difficult. Of Zebulun in verse 13, notice that it says, "He shall dwell at the shore of the sea, and his border shall be at Sidon." Now, Sidon would be, you see Tyre that's listed in Asher's territory at the very top there, that pink Asher coral color. But the white above Asher is really where the Sidonians live, Tyre and Sidon. All right, so at one point, Asher actually, the border extended and conquered all that way. Now what do we do with this prophecy? Because neither is true of Zebulun. Look at Zebulun, the arrow pointing at it. Is it near the sea, either the Sea of Galilee or the Mediterranean Sea? It's landlocked in the middle of Asher, Naphtali, Manasseh, Issachar. It's not even bordering the sea. And then it's not even near bordering Sidon. Asher is much, much closer than Zebulun. So what are we to do with this? Obviously, somebody who doesn't believe the Bible just has a heyday with something like this. I mean, look at the contradictions they say. But you and I know all too well that the Bible often speaks in hyperbole, or it is also looking at other factors that we've not, that are not being considered here. There are good reasons to believe the Bible is very sound in what it says, but we still have to do our best to explain what's going on here. Now, I sent you out an article that you can get in your email box from Wayne Jackson. Wayne Jackson is a brother in the Lord among the more conservative institutional brethren. He's a very, very fine Bible teacher. And he has a really good article I found in the Christian Courier on what to do with this prophecy of Zebulun. So I'm only going to give you a very brief synopsis of it here. And I sent the article to you so that you'll have more detail and where he goes with his passages and all of that. First of all, he marshals a lot of evidence from conservative commentaries like Leupold, an older commentary, Kidner, a more modern commentator, but both conservative, that the prepositions that are used here, that are translated "at the shore of the sea," and his border shall be at Sidon, that it can mean towards or near, not necessarily as we would think. At means right up to the border of it. So that is one possible idea that has been put forth. The second is that it is near enough to the seacoast and near enough to Sidon to be, as they said, enriched by the seaborne trade. Now, Tyre and Sidon and the Phoenicians, that's who the national people are. The Phoenicians were well known for their being a seagoing people. So obviously trade was brought across the Mediterranean from other places, Greece and Rome and others, as time went on. Obviously they're near enough to be greatly enriched by that. And so that's one possible explanation. A third is that the tribes wondered that sometimes we look at these hard and fast borders. We even see in Joshua saying here to here to there. Yes, that was where their land was given, but the tribes wondered. If you'll think about Dan, for instance, Dan's down there in the middle with Ephraim, but you remember that Dan migrates, and we have that whole ending of the book of Judges. One of the appendices is about this whole migration of Dan. If you go up into Naphtali, look at the very top of Naphtali, right there at the Sea of Galilee, and you see Naphtali. Dan, you see the city of Dan. Well, Dan's whole tribe migrates up there. So the later borders, Dan is just absorbed by Ephraim and that type of deal, and Dan just moves. And we're told by Josephus in his work Antiquities, and there's the reference for you, that was true of Zebulun, that Zebulun wondered. So the hard and fastness of where their territory was. You think about Joseph and Mary in the New Testament were from the tribe of Judah, yet they're living in Nazareth, and Nazareth is in Zebulun, Issachar, right in that area. And when it talks about Jesus he went to dwell at Capernaum, it definitely says in Matthew 4:13, he went to dwell at Capernaum in Zebulun that was by the sea. So by the time of the New Testament, Zebulun is because Capernaum, if you look at a map, is right on the Sea of Galilee, or very, very close to it. Just borders of just a very few miles, so that it makes sense. And it could be that in looking forward into time, that was what was under consideration. So these are just possible suggestions. But again, you could get a headache going through each of these trying to show the different things. And I just wanted to point that out to you about Zebulun. We're not going to look at the other ones. We'll drop down to Joseph at verses 22 to 26. Now, if you read Joseph's, it is just talking about the terrible trouble that he went through. The archers shot at him, but the bravery, courage, and that God watched out for him. And the blessings are just over and over again that are brought out for Joseph. And that was true. We see a picture here depicting Jacob with his hand on the head of Joseph, and Joseph dressed in the fine linen of the rulers of Egypt. So Nathan Ward says in his commentary, it is interesting that there are no great spiritual blessings foretold for Joseph's descendants. Regardless of how faithful their father Joseph was, the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh never excelled in faithfulness. For instance, Jeroboam, an Ephraimite, 1 Kings 11:26, led the northern kingdom into idolatry from which it never recovered. Remember, it will often say, they followed in the sins of King Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. And it will say that about king after king after king that came, that they just followed in the ways of this ungodly man. And he was an Ephraimite. He was from one of the sons of Joseph. I mean, you think of how far they fell and how much different they were than their father. Now, to balance Ward's quote, I think that we ought to also mention that Joshua, Numbers 13:8, and Samuel, 1 Samuel 1:1, both came from the tribe of Ephraim and led God's people faithfully. So, as I mentioned to you last week, Reuben never has a national leader, but obviously you do from Ephraim and Manasseh, that blessing that was given to Joseph's sons. But nonetheless, they are not in the same vein as their father, so it doesn't seem that anything of the blessing of Joseph here, goes on to talk about his descendants. And I think in that Ward is correct. All right, so Jacob is about to die, and he makes his sons promise him, swear to him, as he had made Joseph. Of course, Joseph had the authority. Bury me with my fathers. So as Leupold says in his commentary, it is not merely the unimportant whim of a dying man, but a direction with purpose. It's not just that he wants to be buried, because that's where the family plot happens to be. But even in their deaths, all three patriarchs wanted their children to have clear testimony that they had believed God's promises. And Jacob takes great pains here to mention each patriarch and their wives. Jacob names Abraham and Sarah, and Isaac and Rebekah. And there he says, I buried Leah, and there's where I want to be buried. In the cave of Machpelah, he names exactly where it is, east of Mamre, which is Hebron, what we will know as Hebron. How many things happened there of biblical import in the land of Canaan. So that place that Abraham bought to bury Sarah, and then in turn each of them are buried there because they want to partake in the promise. They know they will never see it, but they want to be there, even if their decayed remains is all that is there, that they have faith in believing what God promised, that it will come to pass. So this is a modern day view of the Mosque of Abraham, and it is on the site of what is and has been considered traditionally the Cave of Machpelah. And we don't have much reason to believe that's not accurate. Remember that the Muslim people, the Arabic people, they came, remember, through Ishmael and through the sons of Keturah. They descended from Abraham. So they have a very strong reverence to Abraham. And so inside of that mosque, you can see two kind of tent-like structures, and you can go do your own research, see the pictures. And one is the tomb of Isaac, it's called, and the other. But there's a cave that once was, and it's still there, but obviously you're not allowed to enter there. And if you ever go to the land today of Palestine, Hebron is just one of the off limits. It's so controlled by the Arabic peoples that it's a very dangerous place for any Westerner to go, and particularly any American to go, because you just will basically be able to view it from pictures and that kind of thing. But I just wanted you to be aware of that, and that a great mosque is built over it to this day. All right, so Jacob, after he's finished blessing his sons. The text says to us that he gathered his feet, drew them up into the bed, and breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. And remember that we talked about what that gathered to his people obviously does not mean he's not even yet buried with him. The gathered to his people, I believe, is a statement of the afterlife and a veiled reference to the fact that who he goes to be with, that he just didn't cease to exist, but he goes to be with the ones in eternity where the spirits of men that depart from the body and await the resurrection go. And so in verses 1 through 3, we're told that Joseph fell on his father's face and kissed him, instructed the embalmers to embalm his father. And as God had promised Jacob that Joseph would close his eyes in death in chapter 46:4, indeed, that is what happens. So it says to us that the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. And I want you to notice how important that is. The level of respect shown to Jacob, Joseph's father, was huge. 70 days of mourning was just that short of the 72 days that were prescribed at any Pharaoh's death. So that's how high an honor. He's not going to be held in the highest honor as a Pharaoh, but he's going to be held as close to that as would be reasonable to the Egyptians. So the verses that follow this then, 7 through 9 particularly, say this. With him, you remember that Jacob goes to Pharaoh's house and asks them to ask Pharaoh whether there's a different Pharaoh by this time, and Joseph is honored, but not the nearness that he was to the other Pharaoh that he would have known and had blessed him so. Don't know quite sure, but the approach that he does is through those that were the elders and of the household. They go to the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh, of course, obviously still highly regards, if he's the same one, then you understand. But if he's his son, he highly regards Joseph, and he says, as your father bids you to do, you do. Go bury your father in the land of Canaan. And then he instructs his own people. With him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, all the elders of the land of Egypt. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen, so a mighty military protection and procession, a very great company, it says. Here's a picture that was painted by a French artist, Tissot, lived in the 19th century basically, and just a kind of a trying to recreate to us something of what it would look like for this great, great entourage of people to go and there to remember. Remember, as they arrived at the threshing floor of Atad, they had another 7 days added to the 70 of mourning, great grief, so that it was renamed after grief of Egypt. And there they bury him in the cave of Machpelah, the sons of Jacob, and then it says that Joseph and his brothers returned to Egypt. So at this point, now that Jacob is dead, the brothers say, at verse 15, it may be that Joseph will hate us. Isn't it fascinating that the Joseph narrative began with his brothers hating Joseph, chapter 37, 4 through 8. Now it ends with them still, after all these years, 17 years after the forgiveness, the initial forgiveness, and that he had protected them and taken care of them, and they had prospered and grown, obviously, in those 17 years. Yet they are worried now. Now the axe will fall because our father is dead. And so his brothers send word that Jacob wanted Joseph to forgive them. And they come to him personally, and they fall down before him. Literally, they threw themselves down. So again, think about, once again, fulfilling the dream, the early dreams of Joseph, where the sheaves fell down, his brothers before his sheaf, the 11 sheaves, and then the 11 stars bow down before him. And Joseph cries, of course, weeps at this. And at verse 19, he just simply says, am I in the place of God? What he had learned through those long years of struggle, and then saw slowly but then very clearly of the providence of God, that what you meant by evil, God meant it for good, as he says in these verses. So Hamilton says Genesis begins by telling us about a primeval couple, Adam and Eve, who tried to become like God, and ends by telling us about a man who denied he was in God's place. Adam and Eve attempted to wipe out the dividing line between humanity and deity. Joseph refuses to cross that line. So as the days draw forward, in verse 24, Joseph will make the sons of Israel. So we are to not think of his brothers, though some of them could have been alive. But remember, Joseph was a son of an old age, and so it could well be that they had all already passed on, but some of them, of course, could have been alive. But they were not going to remain alive. I believe he's taking this oath of the generations, the grandsons and the great-grandsons of Jacob, the sons of Joseph and the sons of his brothers and their grandsons and great-grandsons, that Joseph lived to see of his own, it mentions, of Ephraim. God will visit you and bring you up out of this land, to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Interestingly, this is the first mention of the three patriarchs together in the Bible, but it will be time and time again that we will say Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and it will always be a synonym for faith. They all three believed. They passed that faith on. They all wanted to be buried and were buried in the land of Canaan in order, with their principal wives, in order to symbolize that faith that they believed with all their hearts that God would bring it to pass. And so at verse 25, Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, "You shall carry up my bones from here." And when Joseph dies, the last words are of the book. He is put in a coffin in Egypt, but it's only a temporary place. In fact, the Hebrew author will mention both of these things, what he told them in verse 24 and verse 25, and it will be the symbol of his great faith. The coffin with his bones, as Kyle says, became a standing exhortation to Israel to turn its eyes away from Egypt to Canaan, the land promised to its fathers, and to wait in the patience of faith for the fulfillment of the promise. Can you imagine? They remembered through those next 400 years, they passed it down from generation to generation, the exact location of where Joseph was buried. You think the Egyptian king that could have cared less, that didn't remember Joseph, would even have cared about or even would have known where Joseph was buried? But the Israelites did, and they kept up with it. And so Moses commanded in Exodus 13:19, as they were about to disembark from the land on the great Exodus, to go get Joseph's bones. And then in Joshua 24:32, the end of Joshua, it says that they buried him at Shechem. Remember that Jacob had bought that land and had taken it, as he said, by his sword and his bow. That's where they bury the bones of Joseph, because Joseph also wanted to share as his father and as his grandfather and great-grandfather had done in the great faith that God would bring to pass what he had promised. All right, I want to close with this quote from Davis. Genesis began with the brightness and glory of God's original creation. All that he did was pronounced good. However, sin entered the picture, and the book ends not with man in a beautiful garden, but with the bones of Joseph in a coffin. His coffin is a grim reminder of the effects of sin. But just as Joseph was hopeful and optimistic when he died, so we rejoice in the redemption which God has provided. While our bones may rest in the wilderness of a cursed earth, they will one day be resurrected, and there will be a new heaven and a new earth. Isn't that a great promise? Isn't that a great future? And you and I, just like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph, can share in that same faith, of that belief that the coffin and the tomb are not the final word, but that God will one day come and we will be resurrected if we die before he returns. And our bodies will be resurrected, and we will have a new body of some kind. As Paul talks about, the seed that's sown is not the same body that sprouts from it, but we, like that, will be given a great and new body of a new heaven and a new earth. Once again, thank you for the study with me in Genesis, and for all the comments that you have made. It's been a blessing.